without mens rea or guilty mind, without an intention to do harm, is one culpable? Asbestos was widely used in construction, and the signs then did not indicate that the material would cause harm. The providers of asbestos had proceeded in good faith. When new knowledge established the harmful effects of the material and was accepted by the industry and its experts, its usage was phased out. If there is an intention to cause harm or to continue peddling the product despite its harm being well established, for instance in the tobacco industry, it would seem just that the agent manufacturing and profiting from the product will have a moral responsibility to take action to remove the harmful products and compensate those harmed. Similarly, consumers also have to bear some responsibility to avoid using what is now a known harmful product. However, in the case of unintended consequences, since there is no intention, is then no one responsible? Arguably, that is the case. No one is responsible. It appears to be a case of bad luck if one is afflicted, for instance with cancer from the asbestos in their home, for the generation of people who are living in homes with asbestos before new knowledge about its toxicity emerged. Nonetheless, to solely blame the asbestos producers may seem reasonable, since they had profited from selling the material even if they had halted sales when the knowledge emerged. However, did the government agencies in charge of approving construction materials, the public health authorities, and academic institutions which house the scientific experts regarding the matter not have any responsibility? Should then the state be held responsible and have to compensate the victims? Should the state create a fund to cover unknown risk? Since the magnitude of compensation is unknown, might it have to make unplanned sizable payouts from its past reserves, since the economy after all had benefited from the construction activity that involved the harmful asbestos? If unintended consequences are unavoidable and inescapable, simply happening to agents in an unplanned and somewhat random way, is it simply a matter of luck? If so, does it imply that there is hence no responsibility for bad unintended outcomes? However, if the outcomes were good, for instance a profitable asbestos industry prior to the new knowledge of its harm, why should these private companies be allowed to retain their profits but when outcomes turn sour, to socialize the costs? Unintended consequences could after all be positive or negative. Whoever starts a company will have an intention of profitability. How the outcome could be positive but unintended is that the profits turned out to be far greater than the entrepreneur had expected. Conversely, what business failure is clearly a possibility for any entrepreneur. They certainly do not intend to fail, making this a case of foreseeable but unintended consequence. Business failure can have devastating consequences for the entrepreneur, such as bankruptcy, a bad reputation, or even suicide. However, such risks are seen as par for the course in conducting a business, and governments are not standing by to bail out failing companies, though they do benefit from taxing profitable firms. Hence, while the agents involved may not be morally culpable for harm resulting from their activities, they might bear the unintended consequences, though that liability may be limited in the case of a limited liabilities company. Governments and other bodies unrelated to the agents, such as charitable organizations, may also make efforts to compensate, help, or support victims. The victims may also bear the unintended consequences, for instance in suffering death or other harms resulting from the use of a product with no compensation from anyone. In practice, how the blame is apportioned depends on how the representatives argue before the court, and consequences may be shared between the parties. Responsibility is taken in the sense that someone bears the consequences, though culpability may be justifiably denied by the bearer of the unintended consequences. Unintended consequences pose a difficulty for agents since they arise in an unexpected and unplanned way. If the punishment for unintended consequences is too harsh, it can act as a barrier to the conduct of activity. For instance, Amin owns a bookshop. He brought in a large stock of a title that was later banned by the government. However, he had already paid the publisher, who would not take back the books since that was the terms of their deal, and the government was not willing to compensate him either. He ended up bankrupt. Because the bookshop was not a limited liability company, his personal assets were seized to cover the debt resulting from the payment for the books. He ended up poorer than before he started the bookshop. One can imagine him cursing the day he decided to go into business. Such cases of personal liability are in fact a cause for the creation of a limited liability business structure to protect the personal assets of the entrepreneur. After all, Amin's action of selling books is unrelated to his personal asset of his house. since that house was not related to the activities of the bookshop, for example, if he had bought the house before he started the bookshop. If carrying out a small business activity can expose one to the loss of everything one personally owned, then such activities would be much less to the detriment of society, since such business activities may be desired by members of that society. There is a need for adventure on the part of individuals who wish to exercise their freedom to expand the limits of their experience. Society also needs such people to propel its development, to take risks, to find new ways of doing things and create new products and markets. However, unintended consequences can arise. Hence, agents need to be shielded from such consequences so that they are not discouraged from venturing. Protections include legal structures such as LLCs and private and public insurance schemes to pool risks across a collective, and social structures to provide a security net for those who fail. Risk pooling in insurance depend on the different risk exposures of those who sign up for it. For instance, in compulsory healthcare insurance, premiums are paid into a pool which is then used to pay out when medical expenses occur. The older demographic will have more claims than the younger groups, since on average older people have more healthcare needs than younger ones. Hence, they may be required to pay comparatively higher premiums. However, even within the same demographic group, different policyholders incur expenses at different times, with some remaining healthy and hence incurring no expenses and requiring no payouts. It spreads the burden of impending expenses across as many policyholders, making it possible to pay out when needed by individual policyholders. It alleviates a liquidity crisis for the individual, since it collects regular small premiums from them over the policy period, while payouts are less frequent, though they may be a large sum. Individuals who do not make any claims or less frequent and smaller ones are in effect paying for the ones making more frequent and larger claims. However, what they get is the comfort of knowing that should they have to make a claim, they can depend on the insurance to be able to pay out. As for social structures, it can be a state-funded structure of social welfare financed by tax collections, or it can be a private yet social structure, for instance a social structure of families taking care of their own family members, such as a rich person underwriting a new business of her child's. These concepts, schemes, and structures help alleviate the suffering resulting from unintended consequences. In turn, because the individuals enjoying such benefits feel secure, they can then embark on more ambitious, risky projects that, when successful, enrich the society also. Conversely, societies without such schemes and structures suffer the opposite effect. If one cannot afford for things to go wrong, one has to be very cautious, and hence no big venture can be judiciously undertaken. Inequality will increase since only the rich can afford to take business risks, in turn reaping the profits of their ventures while being able to afford their losses. A balance needs to be struck, since if the benefits are overly generous relative to the premiums, it can lead to reckless risk-taking while undermining the sustainability of the insurance or welfare scheme, while if the benefits are too meager, risk-taking may be stymied. As individual agents, we take actions that may lead to unintended consequences. The impact of these unintended consequences can be limited to the self only, for example if I unintentionally cut my finger while sorting through some papers. However, as individuals living among others, even what seems limited to oneself can have effects on others, especially those close to oneself, such as one's family or loved ones. For instance, my bleeding finger caused me to be unable to prepare lunch for my children. There might be also wider effects that affect others in society. Such effects on others are part of the human condition of living in a society. For instance, Lily has been living with a chronic medical condition that has brought her grave suffering. She wishes to be euthanized. While her death from euthanasia most immediately affects herself, it also has an effect on her loved ones, some of whom may support her decision, while some may feel that there still remains hope for a cure so long as Lily remains alive, and hence she should not be euthanized. It may also affect the morale of the society that permits or disallows such a way of dying. Is good intention in conducting an action a sufficient reason to excuse agents for unintended consequences that may arise? In the past, and still in some countries today, beating children to discipline them is acceptable, possibly even desirable, so as to develop good character in them. While it may be carried out with the best of intentions by the parents or at school, what if it leads to negative unintended consequences such as psychological trauma for the child? Say a child, Richard, due to this trauma, grows up to become a mass murderer. Are the parents to blame, or is it the society, since the parents were just doing what was considered a norm or what was even laudatory in that society? Are good intentions enough to shield them from blame and its related responsibility? Further, who is this responsibility owed to? In the case of Richard, we might agree that there is a responsibility owed to the victims he murdered and their families. How about their friends who may suffer pain from being separated in such a way from the victims? How about Richard's own friends who may suffer guilt for not being able to support him through his psychological pain, which might then have led to the murders? How about Richard himself, whose life might have taken a different turn had he not been subject to such beatings from his parents in the name of discipline? How about people completely unrelated to the murders but may experience fear knowing that there are mass murderers in the world? How about future generations who did not come into existence since their would-be parents were murdered by Richard? Arguably, responsibility is owed to each of them, though it is impossible to quantify what penance will be sufficient to account for anything other than direct losses, such as to the victims. For instance, one victim, Esther, was employed as a manager. A loss of expected income can be calculated as the amount of compensation to be paid out to Esther's family. But what if it is argued that had she continued living, she could have given birth to a Nobel Prize winner who would have devised a solution to save the planet? That may seem far-fetched and is clearly speculative. What is less doubtful is to assume that each of Esther's potential children will in turn have children and so on, using well-established statistical averages. Esther's murder led to this entire line of people not coming into existence. Even if Richard was given the death penalty for murdering Esther, would his one life be sufficient to compensate for the multitude of Esther's descendants that were lost? Conversely, using the same logic, we could argue that Richard in fact saved them, since they would have been born into a world of suffering. Should we then reward him? Clearly, whatever punishment is meted out would have an arbitrariness to it. Richard was given the death penalty by hanging. For Esther's family, his death by hanging will not bring back Esther or compensate them for lost earnings from Esther. Its function is more societal. Hanging Richard prevents him from murdering more people and is a deterrence to those contemplating becoming murderers. What Esther's family got is a sense that justice had been served, though that may be cold consolation for the loss of their loved one. Having explicated the nature of unintended consequences, what remains is what we are going to do about them. Becoming paralyzed from fear of unintended consequences is not an adequate response, since that can lead to plenty of unintended negative consequences, such as becoming overly anxious, developing mental illness from the anxiety, or not daring to try anything new. Besides, it is futile since whatever you do or not do, unintended consequences can arise. We have to live with unintended consequences. We need to recognize the absurdity of how our best intentions can turn out badly, but yet have the courage to continue forging ahead anyway. Can we be like Albert Camus' Sisyphus and imagine, despite the drudgery and absurdity of life, that we can be happy anyway? Many of our decisions have to be made under conditions of uncertainty. This uncertainty can be from an ignorance of existing knowledge, as Merton has pointed out in the first of his causes of unintended consequences. However, even if we have expert knowledge on the direct and specific field the decision seems to be about, there remains many other aspects that are unaccounted for. We cannot account for it all, but even if we could, there remains the unknowable future. But decide we must, and we do so, sometimes in an arbitrary way since it hardly seems to matter, and we do not have the information or the time and energy to go find that information. Sometimes the decision is important, and we invest the time and energy, but things turn out in an unintended way anyway. Sometimes we fall back on our value system to help guide us. Sometimes our imagination runs away from what is at hand, pitching us slippery slope arguments which could possibly result, but it's unlikely to. Sometimes we throw caution to the wind and it turns out well or badly. Nonetheless, we have to keep moving, to keep living. It is humbling to know that our plans may turn out badly no matter how well conceived they are, no matter how careful we are in their execution. With an awareness of unintended consequences, we can acknowledge that there is a limit to planning, that we do not and cannot know everything. Avoiding pride and hubris shields us against the psychological suffering when things turn out in unexpected ways. We should continue to plan nonetheless, since a failure to plan will give rise to expected and foreseeable failures, which could have been avoided with a proper plan. Planning removes avoidable elements of uncertainty, which if not avoided only serves to further complicate matters. However, we should not be dogmatic about our plans. We need to be flexible to modify our plans as the situation develops. Such course corrections are needed since once the situation makes clear that the plan is no longer adequate, Negative outcomes from not correcting would then not be caused by unintended consequences but are negligence, since the consequences have become foreseeable. Hence, important plans should not be allowed to run on autopilot but instead be monitored and adapted as events unfold. To plan well, we need to plan with a holistic view insofar as our existing knowledge allows, considering angles where unwanted side effects may arise. We need to put in place buffers to cushion against what may go wrong. Engineers over-design structures, making bridges stronger than what even a maximum expected load would require by a factor of several times. This means more structural members and materials are used in their construction, costing more and taking longer to build. They learn this lesson on safety factors through past situations where what was unplanned nonetheless happened. They learn this lesson from past engineering failures paid for in human lives and ruined reputations. Testing may be necessary to surface what may otherwise be missed. Designers have blind spots. For instance, when building a train station, the architect may have conscientiously ensured the tracks and varying train sizes are accounted for, taking care to have spacious waiting halls and an adequate number of lifts, staircases, and escalators leading to the platforms. Despite his greatest effort, he may still miss important details, such as having toilets in the station, which he only discovered when a soft launch of the station was ongoing. This is not a failure. This is why tests such as soft launches are needed. A failure will be to allow the train station to become fully operational without toilets. All this speaks of an attitude of caution on the part of planners, designers, and engineers. Consulting with direct stakeholders has become a norm, but such consultations may need to be extended to those on the margins or who may be indirectly affected. For instance, if we plan to build an apartment block on a piece of land currently occupied by squatters, we will work with the key stakeholders to decide the configurations of the various apartments and building in what customers want in their future homes, such as electrical circuitry and plumbing. However, we should also consider the squatters who will be displaced, heritage and environmental factors such as whether structures of historical importance needs to be preserved or relocated, or how we are going to responsibly deal with the plant and animal life that will be affected. Since the plants and animals cannot speak for themselves, we may have to work with groups representing these interests. To know what to consider and who to consult requires experience but also imagination and openness. Previously, the squatters may be unceremoniously thrown out, and having little negotiation power, it may go largely unnoticed, but it takes an open and caring attitude to realize that this group has been neglected, and then to have the sense of duty to consider them in the plans and provide for their needs. Imagination is also required to think of what could possibly go wrong. A useful framework that is in practice is to consider probability versus impact of potential events. High probability, high impact events, such as accidents taking place in our train station example, require the walkways to be wide enough for emergency paramedics to access the injured with their equipment and possibly their vehicles. A high probability but low impact event, such as a cold soda being spilled, may require no prior action at all. It can be responded to when it happens. This likewise goes for low probability, low impact events. For low probability but high impact events, mitigation is needed. For instance, water sprinklers to put out seldom occurring but catastrophic fires. However, if it cannot be mitigated, compensation may be necessary. For instance, Ben was waiting with a hot coffee on the platform. He was alarmed by the horn of the train pulling into the station and spilled his drink on the person next to him. While the probability of this happening was low, the victim was badly scalded. Given how infrequent something like that happens, the train station may be unable to take measures against such incidents, and if deemed responsible, can compensate on a case-by-case basis. Whatever the case may be, we need to act responsibly and in a reasonable way when the unintended consequences arise, even if we are not culpable. By we, all parties are meant. The cold soda was spilled unintentionally by the passenger, so it hardly makes sense for the station master to seek to penalize her. Likewise, Ben's hot coffee was spilled unintentionally on the victim, so it makes little sense for the victim to sue Ben or the train company, just like it would make little sense for Ben to run away. Instead, Ben could behave reasonably and provide assistance such as calling for first aid or keeping the victim calm while awaiting help. Even bystanders can help. Bruno Latour, in his essay Love Your Monsters, writes about the unintended consequences technology can have. Just as we confuse Frankenstein for the monster, we also misunderstand Dr. Frankenstein's real sin. For Dr. Frankenstein's crime was not that he invented a creature through some combination of hubris and high technology, but rather that he abandoned the creature to itself. Even if we did not intentionally create the consequence, we can and should act responsibly. Ben can render aid and apologize without accepting liability. What would be irresponsible, though not criminal, would be for Ben to run away, leaving the victim alone to fend for himself. We need to care for the monsters of our unintended consequences that we create. Lastly, since the uncertainty of life along with unintended consequences seem inevitable, we might as well embrace it. Unintended consequences are not by its nature necessarily negative. We can learn from previous unintended consequences. Uncertain outcomes may even provide a way out of difficult circumstances. In the folktale Nasreddin and the Sultan's Horse, the tyrannous Sultan wanted to behead Mullah Nasreddin because he was offended by Nasreddin's joke. Nasreddin was known to be a skilled teacher, and he offered that if the Sultan delayed his sentence by a year, he would teach the Sultan's horse to sing. While the Sultan did not believe that was possible, he nonetheless gave Nasreddin the year. That evening, Nasreddin's friends were allowed to visit him in prison and found him in unexpectedly good spirits. "How can you be so happy?" they asked. "Do you really believe that you can teach the Sultan's horse to sing?" "Of course not," replied Nasreddin, "but I now have a year which I did not have yesterday, and much can happen in that time. The Sultan may come to repent of his anger and release me. He may die in battle or of illness. He may be overthrown, or the horse may die, in which case the Sultan will be obliged to release me. Finally, even if none of those things come to pass, perhaps the horse can sing." In conclusion, our actions and plans sometimes lead to unintended consequences. This phenomenon is widespread but yet remains mysterious because we seem helpless to combat it given its nature of appearing exposed. Some may attribute it simply to chance or the inscrutable will of God or providence or fate. By studying what is meant by intention and consequences and the causes of unintended consequences, this paper aims to improve our understanding of the concept. As they are unintended, we may not be culpable since we do not possess mens rea, though this does not mean that we can then escape taking responsibility by acting responsibly. People have a need for adventure which can lead to unintended consequences. Society needs such people to propel its development. As a society, we can and have created structures and schemes to protect our members from unintended consequences. As a general strategy on an individual and societal level, we need to remain open to modifying our plans as the situation evolves, adopt a holistic planning approach, act responsibly and reasonably when unintended consequences arise, and embrace the uncertainty of life. While we will not eliminate unintended consequences through these strategies, we can ameliorate their effects and adequately respond to them. Thank you for listening to my essay on unintended consequences. I hope you have some thoughts on this. Please share them with us, and please like, share and subscribe to the Philosophical Bachelor.